we should start. So for those of you who are late, so welcome to the Next Billion Renewable Energy User Opportunity webinar by Alten Insights Relearn program. So the first to present will be Isaac Garcia. Isaac, would you like to, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thanks, Carlos. Thanks to everyone that has connected today to this webinar. My name is Isaac Garcia. I'm the head of project development for Alten Renewable Energy. Alten Renewable Energy is an IPP that is only focused on solar PV. I'm the head of project development for Asia and for Africa. Also, I'm a member of the board, and I'm responsible to develop new markets.
Thank you, Isaac. And Ricky, could you introduce yourself briefly? Ricky, your microphone is on mute, so we can't hear you.
Sorry about that, Carlos.
Okay.
It's good to be here. My name is Ricky Butch. I help lead commercial efforts for GE Power's portfolio of hybrid distributed power solutions. And so we focus globally on both off-grid and weak-grid areas, deploying solar renewable systems.
Thank you very much, Ricky. So Isaac, whenever you're ready, share your presentation and start. Now you're on mute, Isaac.
You can see now, I think.
Yes.
The presentation sounds great. Perfect.
If you get it to full screen, perfect. Yeah, now we can see.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you very much, Ricky and Araceli. Let me first, this is a presentation, okay, that we have prepared for the next 1 billion. As I told you, I'm the head of project development of the company and a member of the board. No? During my presentation, I will explain you a little bit about our company, only few seconds, let's say, and about our international footprint in different countries. And later we will go to the main figures of what does it mean, the lack of access to electricity, okay, and why, because always we are speaking about the lack of funds, the lack of different grants, donors, etc. But we need to focus on why there's this lack of electricity. Models from investor point of view, okay, I have tried to focus this from the IPP point of view, okay, what an IPP like ourselves or like one of our competitors can do to make this feasible, no? Because at the end of the day, it's quite important not having only the public, the institutional investment, also having the private companies working on this, no? And two examples, Copa and PowerHive, and that are examples that have been, I think, quite successful on getting some business models for the access to electricity, and finally some conclusions, okay, about what we have been discussing. Then let me introduce Alten. Okay, Alten is an IPP. Okay, it's an IPP that was incorporated 11 years ago in Spain, focused only on solar PV. Due to the problems in Spain with the energy policy, we have decided to go overseas and to start investment in 2 different regions of the world: Latin America, mostly Mexico, and Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. No? During this time, what we have done is to develop projects in Mexico, where we have connected 350 megawatts, I think it was 3 weeks ago. In Nigeria, where we have signed a PPA with Embed of 120 megawatts. In Kenya, where we have been developed several projects. Okay, one of them has signed a PPA with Kenya Power, and we will start construction in 2 days, 2 or 3 days. And in Namibia, a project of 45 megawatts in which we have already finalized the construction, and now we are with the taking over date and with the punch list, let's say. No? Then only to give you an idea, we're an IPP, okay, focused on solar PV, that we create our opportunities, we raise the equity and the debt by ourselves, we remain as the majority shareholder, and now we are looking for new opportunities in solar. No? Let's go to what is important for you and important for me in this presentation. No? Let's go to the lack of electricity. In this presentation, you can see in this slide, you can see first of all that where is located the lack of access to electricity in the world. Okay, we're speaking about roughly 1 billion people living without electricity, but there are two important markets in which there is this lack of access to electricity. Mostly in Africa, okay, we're speaking about 60%, we're speaking about more than 600 million people are living without access to electricity, and the rest is almost 100% in Asia, with an important focus in India. No? That's quite important to keep in mind to develop this kind of markets. Another important point to keep in mind is that we are speaking about the lack of electricity access in rural areas. No? We are speaking that the rural areas are the most affected ones in terms of the lack of access to electricity. No? Then going to the focus, we're speaking about Africa, Asia, and rural areas. No? That's quite important to keep in mind. In terms of institutions, I think that there is no need to make a list, okay, of the institutions that are willing to finance, that are willing to invest, to develop this kind of alternatives, of this kind of projects to give access to electricity. You know, we can speak about CDC, Proparco, DEG, all the different multilateral institutions that are willing to develop this kind of projects, that have grants, donors, funds available, and that you can see a lot of different initiatives on this sense. No? It's good to remind one of the first initiatives in the world, that is the ESMAPA from the World Bank, that provides technical knowledge and, let's say, technical assistance for all those IPPs, institutions, nations that are willing to develop this kind of mini-grids, microgrids to give access to electricity. No? Going to the why, okay, now we have clear that we have Africa and Asia and the rural areas without access, okay. We have mentioned that there's a problem of lack of resources, okay. It's true that there are resources on the market, but it's true that there are lack of resources. But there are two important points: the grid stability and the connection charge, okay. In terms of the grid stability, why we are speaking about this? At the end of the day, and it's a personal opinion, microgrids and mini-grids are the future for these communities, but we cannot think that there will be a future, let's say, for the 100 years. No, we need to develop in parallel the grid. Okay, at the end of the day, we need to get these microgrids, mini-grids connected to a grid. Okay. Mostly in the countries which problems with grid stability, they have also problems with grid with electricity access. No, because at the end of the day, the grids are quite small. The grids have quite old. They are quite old. They have not good maintenance. They have poor maintenance, and that's the reason, because it's something quite important. They don't have access to electricity because the grid stability, the grid maintenance is not good. Another important point is the connection charge. Okay, we can have a very good, very reliable, quite good quality electricity access, but it's not feasible to get the consumers connected. No, in this graphic you can see a very important ideas. No, first of all, which is the monthly income that we should spend to get connected into the grid, and which is the monthly income that we should pay in order to pay the electricity for a family of 4 people. No? We can see countries like Botswana, like Madagascar, with several problems, in which probably we will have a very good access to electricity, but it's not possible to pay such access, and also the invoices from the electrical company. No? It's important this to keep in mind. Then we can speak about 3 different models, no, to solve this situation. Microgrids managed on a decentralized basis. Let's say that we are speaking about all these kind of power plants, small power plants that can be developed and by an international institution or by a national institution, and can be owned by the local authorities. No? Investment on distribution grids, that it's quite easy to think about this, but it's something that we need to think in parallel. And microgrid managed on a centralized basis. Okay. In terms of the microgrid managed on a decentralized basis, is the model that they are following in India, in which the government of India is providing grants, providing donors to help to develop this kind of installations. No? I think it's good because they have been able to get quite, let's say, quite big success. But at the end of the day, they have a lot of disadvantage, because we are speaking about a high financial risk, because this risk is placed on the community, okay, a community lack of resources. There can be a lot of local disputes, and there is a high risk of abandonment. There's a costly assistance, and we remember that mini and microgrids are less efficient than larger grids. In terms of the benefits, the good thing is that we can provide a high level of local employment at the operation, at the construction, flexible tariffs, and autonomous management. That is quite good. This is the model that they have followed in India. But in terms of, let's say, a company that is willing to help to the people to access to electricity, but also to have some revenues for their shareholders, is not easy to manage. That's the reason because I think that at least for companies, for IPPs, the solution will be microgrid managed on a centralized basis. Okay, let's see. The idea is like the telecommunications. We're speaking about several towers. Several towers all around Europe, all around the States, in which the big telecommunications companies have been able to provide access to telecommunications. This can be applicable to the energy sector. This can be applicable. The developer, the IPP, can develop small plots, okay, with small power plants that can produce electricity for the people. And we can sign a PPA with a national institution. For example, the utility, we can sign a PPA, a master PPA, let's say, with a local or a national institutions, and we can make, let's say, enough capacity, let's say 1 megawatt, 2 megawatts, 3 megawatts, that can be financed not on a project finance structure, but with different structures. And this scheme is not new, okay? This scheme is not new. It's how the electricity started to work, for example, in New York, and it's a model that can be replicated here. And this is the model that we think that is feasible to follow in Africa, in Asia, to develop these areas without access to electricity. But one very important point, other than this, is not only the business model, okay? The business model is important, but the most important is the framework. We need to create a framework to develop these kind of projects. First of all, are the regulators. The regulators are key in this model. Regulators should delegate some regulatory tasks to regional and local authorities. The regulators should be able to change the requirements for the generators in terms of mini grids and microgrids, okay, that will help the small developers, the small IPPs, the small communities to develop their projects. And perhaps a regulator for rural areas can be a very good idea to develop this. We have, for example, in Kenya, they are used to have some kind of exemption, some kind of different regulations for the rural areas. And we must keep in mind that the quality standards of supply must be flexible. Okay, we cannot think that we are going to have the best quality in terms of supply of electricity with mini and microgrids. There will be improving with storage, like Ricky will explain later. But now we need to think that the quality standard should be flexible. Then two examples, only two examples that I think that are quite important. We are not speaking about IPPs. We are not speaking about people that has developing projects. We are speaking about business model. We can speak about Encopa Solar, that is based on M-Pesa. Probably you know that in Kenya, around 60% of the transactions, okay, are done with mobile phone. Okay, if you are willing to pay to anyone in Kenya, you are not going to use your money. You are going to use M-Pesa. M-Pesa, so you pay with your mobile phone. You take your mobile phone and you go and you pay. That's the idea. Here, Encopa is a financial service provider for solar kits. Okay, they have been able to provide some resources for all those customers that are willing to buy these solar kits. And the way is that you have an internet connection or a telecommunications connection, and you will pay on a day-by-day basis, okay, your solar kit. This is one of the models. The other one is PowerHive. PowerHive is an American company that has developed, okay, meters, has developed a cloud system that will help to IPPs to establish models like the one that I have previously mentioned. The one in which a model of a mini grid, microgrid on a centralized basis. Okay, PowerHive supplies this kind of of meters that will help the IPP or the utility company, and also a cloud system that can manage the different power stations. No? I don't want to go into the detail. I only want to give you some conclusions, okay? I think that for all the IPPs, solar IPPs, and probably wind, geothermal, but solar, one of the most important markets in the future will be this lack of electricity sector. No? For the next 10 years, we need to make an effort. We need to start thinking. We need to look for solutions because it will help a lot to the people that is living there, and also we will get some revenues for our shareholders. First, there is a lot of international funding available. We should forget probably about project finance scheme, but there is a lot of funding available, and you only need to go to the Africa Development Bank, to the IFC, and you will be able to see that everything is there, no? And we can use it. Also, the utilities and regional and local governments are key to deploy these solutions, okay, are essential to deploy these solutions, and the regulators, as I have mentioned. No? Later, Ricky will explain about storage, but this development will be accelerated thanks to storage systems. And two final points, okay? We need to remember that this mini and microgrids should be deployed in parallel with grid expansion, okay? Something that we cannot forget. It's quite important to keep that in mind. This is a solution, okay, that we can improve, but we need to work in parallel with the grid connection. And for the first time, okay, Africa and Asia will lead the development of this technology. Okay, we cannot think that the solution will apply to Europe at the start or probably to the States. No, Africa and Asia will lead this development. No, from my side, this is all. Okay, thanks for hearing me. Thanks for your time, and I hope that you have enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much, Isaac, for your insightful presentation. So I'm sure that the audience has many questions that they will want to have answered. You know, you guys in the audience, you know, don't be shy. Post your questions on the questions and answers box, which is at the bottom of your toolbar. So far, we've had the first question, so keep them coming, please. Well, now we'll have Ricky Bush from GE present. So Ricky, whenever you're ready, share your presentation and give us your view on how storage could help increase the penetration of rate of electricity in areas where there is no electric power or you know, poor access to electric power currently. So over to you, Ricky.
Great. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks, Isaac. And thanks again for the opportunity to share what we're doing at GE. Before I start, a quick introduction. Again, my name is Ricky Butch, and I help lead commercial outreach for GE Power's efforts in the hybrid distributed power space. You know, GE Power is one of the largest equipment OEMs in the world. I think at last estimate, our equipment powers about 1/3 of the electricity around the world. But most of that is very large power plants. And so over the last few years, GE has been making more concerted efforts in developing solutions around small-scale power systems, which is what we develop. And we actually focus initially on off-grid, although our systems are capable of tying to the grid, just along the lines of the point that Isaac made. And so we have some experience that in deploying these hybrid systems that I'll share with you in off-grid environments, and how we think we can scale the sector. So Isaac had already covered this, but you know, just to reiterate, we have over 1 billion people without access to electricity, much of them in Africa and South and Southeast Asia. We believe an additional 2 billion have insufficient access. The World Bank issued something called the multi-tier framework to try and quantify access to electricity, because up to this point, the definition was actually quite fluid. And so when we incorporate the aspects of reliability and availability, we think there's a much significant larger portion of the population that doesn't have the access that they need. And just on the right, I highlight some of the implications and consequences of not having access to electricity. But I think the problem that these countries face is a little bit broader than just access. The chart on the left there highlights the per capita consumption. And as you can see, you know, for an OECD country, the average person uses about 8,300 kilowatt hours per year. But in Africa, it's 500. And so this is not just, as I mentioned earlier, this is not just an access issue. This is also an availability issue for people that even have a grid connection. And so when you're thinking about expanding overall availability of electricity, what I've done there in the middle is frame, I think, the three general categories you have. You can firm the grid, which is if you have an existing connection, just make sure there's more supply available. Extend the grid out, which, as Isaac pointed out, will be a critical solution for many areas. And then this last one is what I call skip the grid, which, you know, according to the IEA, at least 40% of connections that will happen for the over a billion that don't have access to electricity today will come through these small-scale power systems. And then on the right-hand side, I've noted what I call the energy access solution ladder. A lot of the population right now that is off-grid uses kerosenes, and we've seen increasing penetration of solar lanterns and solar home systems. The focus of my talk moving forward will be the hybrid systems, which I think really complement what we have seen to be a pretty substantial diesel market in the off-grid environment. So the chart on the left there is actually from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They tried to estimate the size of the diesel market for off-grid environments in emerging markets. And their estimate comes out to about 30 gigawatts. And we've approached this through other means as well and have come to a similar conclusion. The short answer on this is that it is an enormous market, one that I think we as the energy sector have generally don't have great estimates on, and certainly I think with energy access in particular, it's an aspect that we have not necessarily addressed entirely. Diesel is very prevalent in some of these environments. And I think there's an opportunity for us to think about how we hybridize those diesel solutions. So that would reduce the cost of operation, improve sustainability, perhaps even improve reliability. And to that effect, on the right there, and this is particularly why GE is investigating and testing new models in the market, we think there is substantial market potential for solutions. And again, this is an IEA estimate, but they assume about, you know, $10 to $15 billion a year will be spent in these types of solutions moving forward in order to move towards the SDG 7, which is around achieving universal access by 2030. So, you know, for companies like GE, we are interested in this market because it allows us to, you know, test new models in these type of emerging markets, but also really try and be competitive in a growing space that we think will have long-term staying power. So speaking of the GE portfolio, this is what we currently offer across the energy access spectrum. So we've had some experience deploying very simple DC systems, similar to what Isaac mentioned around the solar home systems. With MCOPA, we have a small solar storage system that just operates on DC power, supplies basic electricity to DC loads. The core of our portfolio is this hybrid solution, which is a solar energy storage diesel combination. We tend to containerize and deploy it. And then last is the large-scale utility systems, which I think the industry has generally viewed as a microgrid. But increasingly, we're seeing penetration of the first two types of systems as well in some of these off-grid environments. So very quickly on the hybrid system, as I mentioned, it's a containerized solar hybrid that we deploy. Contains energy storage. Right now we use lead-acid batteries, although we are moving towards lithium-ion. It includes a genset because right now it is simply not economic to provide 24/7 power exclusively on solar energy storage. So we do use a diesel for backup. Although compared to a diesel-only setup, the renewables helps reduce the diesel cost anywhere from 30 to 60, 70% based on the load profile. We also have a remote monitoring and diagnostic system that's built on GE's Predix industrial internet cloud. And so we can monitor something like 40 or 50 different parameters on the system in near real time based on the availability of telecom bandwidth and understand how the system is performing. And we also have something called the digital twin, which allows us to understand what the system should be performing at and what it actually is performing at, and try and ascertain as to why there may be a delta in performance. And all this is really to help the microgrid operator drive higher availability, improve reliability, and just make sure that their business rests on delivering electricity, much like any utility would. And so our goal is to provide the tools that they would need to make sure that the system is running at all times. The other thing that we've tried to really focus in on is how we can utilize digital tools to improve the story around deploying the solutions. So on the left-hand side, this is really just speaking to what we do today right now with our hybrid system, which is we have a local controller that will help try and optimize the generation sources between solar, energy storage, and diesel. I mentioned the digital twin, and we're also looking at integrating with downstream metering so that we can provide a single platform for microgrid developers. The remaining two is really about how do we optimize the distribution system, and then how do we try and improve the front end cycle of this. And so on the distribution system, we've started exploring ideas around rooftop tagging, geospatial analysis. What can we do to try and do as much work upfront as possible before we actually send people out, or our customers send people out to try and do a site survey. So again, this is all just bringing down the cost of the front end engineering piece of it. The third column there, we've had some experience partnering with MIT, the MIT Energy Initiative, on using geospatial analysis to help identify sites for mini grids. And so what they've done is they basically will take a look at where the existing grid is. They will look at subsequent sort of population centers and the proximity to the grid, and will then run an economic analysis to determine whether it is more efficient to extend the grid to that community or to deploy a mini grid system. And we actually did a small pilot run in India where we had MIT identify a village that would be best served by a mini grid, and we currently have deployed a 15 kilowatt mini grid system there that's providing power to that village, which I'll go over in our case studies. But for us, this is really, it's not just the hardware piece of this, which I think is, perhaps how the industry has approached this before. Let's just give solar systems in these remote areas. It's really about trying to bring a much more comprehensive solution set to the problem to improve the overall life cycle cost of these mini grids in remote areas. And then this is just speaking to the benefit of hybrid versus diesel only. I mentioned the size of the diesel market, and that's really, I think, why a company like ours is interested in exploring these new business models. This is from a customer in Nigeria. In this case, it is a captive power solution, so it is not a community deployment. But they're a factory. They run diesel right now. And you can see that by adding a little bit of renewables to the diesel mix, we can substantially improve the economics and overall operating cost of the system, effectively taking the levelized cost of electricity from about 65 cents down to about 32 cents. So certainly much higher than what a grid tariff would be, but you can see the payback there is less than 2 years in adding, what upfront may be an expensive investment, but pays off quite quickly. So now just a few case studies. I mentioned the GE portfolio has the small DC solar systems all the way up to the large utility scale systems. We partnered with the Global Himalayan Expeditions over the past 2 years in deploying DC solar storage microgrids in Ladakh, which is a state in northern India. These communities are effectively, ideally suited for this type of solution. As I mentioned, it's really just some solar panels and a few lead acid batteries providing power at 24 volts DC. So really, it's powering LED, mobile phone charging, perhaps a DC television or two. Really, light residential load, nothing larger than that. And it's a pretty small community, maybe 10 to 15 households. So you don't need a large scale hybrid system. But our experience has been quite positive, especially working with Global Himalayan Expeditions. But one of the key things that we picked up was how we can try and facilitate community ownership of these systems, because having the community feel like they have a stake in the solution is very important. And Global Himalayan Expeditions came up with a unique way of doing that around establishing accounts that various households would pay into to help maintain the system. And has been quite successful, I think, in deploying these DC systems in Ladakh. As I mentioned, the core of our portfolio is around the hybrid system. And so I've got 3 case studies here just highlighting different environments in which we've deployed our system. The first one on the left there is in partnership with Tata Power, Delhi Distribution Limited in India. We deployed we have now 2 units running, 2 separate villages in Bihar. MIT used geospatial analysis to help determine the sites and just validate that they were the most economic solution. Delhi the Tata Power came in and worked with the community, and we provided the equipment in this case. Just a lesson that we learned quite quickly was that demand estimation is very hard when you go into an off-grid environment, and you're not really sure what the power profile looks like. Surveys will tell you one thing, but in reality, it's probably something very different. And we found out that the power subscription was actually much lower than we expected. So the system was significantly underutilized. And Tata Power had to rethink how they approached the community and develop productive uses to utilize more of the system's power capability. And so now we've gone from something like under a kilowatt to 8 kilowatts on a 15 kilowatt system, so significantly more utilization. In the middle there, we've had the opportunity to work with the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia, deploying 15 kilowatt solar hybrid systems to power off-grid health centers. The unique thing about this particular design is that it is entirely self-contained within that shipping container. So the solar panels, which I don't have a picture of there, but they actually sit on top of the container. And so the battery, the genset, the power electronics are all inside. And so this is really to try and minimize the transport logistics to site. And what we found is that flexibility in packaging was very important, and it allows us to adapt to different site conditions. And lastly, I think the third one, we talk about Africa and Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia as kind of the key markets, but it's important to also note that there are remote areas in OECD markets as well. Certainly here in North America, throughout the US as well as in Northern Canada, we have a lot of remote communities. We had the opportunity to work with one in Australia. It was an Aboriginal community that was developing a training facility, and we deployed a 30 kilowatt solar hybrid system. They were running on diesel prior to this. And the other thing to note is that these systems are pretty tough when it comes to withstanding inclement weather. This particular solution we designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. The wind speeds in the location where this particular unit was deployed are among the highest in the world. And so the solar system itself, which is actually roof mounted, I think has been rated for 96 meters per second. So these things can also withstand pretty substantial and inclement weather conditions. This is not just for the dry areas. And so just some thoughts on the journey that we've had so far. What we think we've certainly found is that electrification will be an all of the above solution. There will be areas where it absolutely makes sense to extend the grid. There will be areas that are probably not dense enough for a hybrid system. So something like a solar home system or a DC system may be the right solution. But we also believe there are a lot of cases where this solar hybrid with energy storage and diesel will play a significant role. We think that there's a need to have flexibility in the packaging of the solution. But we also think, having the ability to interact with the grid will probably be very important, as Isaac noted earlier. And we think this is an opportunity to really right-size grid investments. So, you look at utilization in the electricity grid in OECD markets, it's, less than 50%, which is basically deploying a lot of capital that's not being used effectively. And so when you're building out the grid, you can think about, how do we use these microgrids in conjunction with building out the grid? Of course, engaging with policymakers is very important. It's very important to have clear regulations around what happens to a mini grid if the grid is extended to that area. Productive uses of electricity is very important. As we found out with one of our units in India, you go in thinking it's one demand profile. It could be very different, and so having flexibility in the system design is very important. Financing is still a little bit of a challenge in the sense that, right now it's still difficult for these solutions to rest entirely on private capital. It's very difficult for these solutions to meet grid tariffs and still be viable. And so we need to think about alternative financial schemes that allow a developer to charge, according to the willingness to pay the community, but also use perhaps some mix of equity, grant, and debt capital. And lastly, we talk about deploying solutions in sort of the downstream operation, but we think there's a lot of value to be gained in streamlining the upfront section of all this, identifying the sites, building the demand profiles, sizing the systems, and doing what we can through automation, through digital technologies to reduce the cost of development upfront before we deploy these solutions. And so with that, thank you very much for the time, and look forward to taking some questions.
Thank you very much, Ricky, for your presentation. You have definitely, prompted the audience to ask a few questions here. So we have, 5 or 6 questions from the audience. So let's start straight away. I have some of my own, but let's start with the questions posted by the audience. So the first question is by Elian, who is asking whether you see a role in energy storage supporting the deployment of renewable energy or of energy in rural and remote areas. So you have already shared some thoughts, Ricky, but what can you say about this? Also, the question goes into the technology that you think that he's asking could win, whether lithium ion or flow batteries. Over to you. Let's start with you, Ricky.
Great. Thank you for that question, Elian. I think so. To address your first question, I absolutely think energy storage is a vital part of the solution mix. That being said, I don't think we're at a stage yet where it is viable to have a purely solar storage system be economic in these remote areas. Generally, the way we've sized our systems is we offer about 3 to 4 hours of energy storage. And so that covers the evening peak for the most part. And then when you have a nighttime load, we can turn the engine on to charge the batteries and then also provide some nighttime load. We have not seen it really be economic to have batteries much beyond that. And certainly not to size it where you are, sizing for say 4 or 5 days of bad weather and still run off the solar power. So, and in terms of technology, we've deployed lead acid primarily for 2 reasons. One is because there's a level of familiarity in the energy access kind of off-grid environment with lead acid batteries. Although we are seeing a transition to lithium. Right now, both the challenge with lithium is the upfront capital expenditure. It's significantly more than lead acid. So, particularly for a microgrid developer that's looking to finance the project, they now need to have significantly more capital for lithium ion. That being said, the life cycle cost is coming down. So we are close to parity from a life cycle perspective between lead acid and lithium. Unfortunately, no one really buys on life cycle cost. And so I think the sell prices have to come down a little bit for us to really see lithium make more inroads in off-grid.
Thank you very much, Ricky. Isaac, would you like to add anything to that?
I think that in terms of technology, I fully agree with Ricky, okay, because we have the same view. In terms of the storage with solar, it's pretty clear. No? Today we are reaching quite low prices from solar power plants, okay, but the storage is not still there. Okay, we need to wait a little bit, probably 1 or 2 years of development. But as Ricky has said, no, the idea is to cover the peak of the evening, the peak of the night. Okay, to have 2, 3, 4 hours storage, but not having storage for 2 or 3 days or 1 week, because it has no sense. And the kind of projects that not only ourselves, but the APPs in Africa are developing are related with 2 or 3 hours of storage, no more than that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your answer. And then we have a question by Rehan, who is asking whether microgrids is something that a small entrepreneur should go into. Do you have a view on this? I think, I don't know if I'm certainly not the best place to answer this question, but do you have a view on whether a small entrepreneur could go into these areas? Is it advisable?
I'll maybe take a first stab and let Isaac then answer it. So I would say that it very much depends on the site. We think there are sites out there that are very viable for entrepreneurs to go out and you know, particularly if you are from the area or are familiar with the area or the communities, then it may make a lot of sense to start a company and to go deploy the solutions. And there certainly is a lot of capital out there, particularly grant capital or programs like Isaac mentioned from the ADB, the AFTB, World Bank, etc. That can help facilitate some of the capital costs around procuring equipment. That being said, you know, community scale systems are challenging, and there may be you know, easier ways to get into the energy access space and to start an energy access venture. We think captive power solutions is an enormous opportunity. So this is with commercial industrial customers that are running on diesel. There's only one customer, so you're not managing risk from multiple off-takers. And you know, there's, as I mentioned in my slides, that we think there's a substantial payback to deploy renewables in some of those instances. And so that may be an easier way to get into, you know, such a market.
Thank you, Ricky. Anything else to add, Isaac? Or
no, I think that like Ricky has mentioned, no, for the local ones, we'll go to community, let's say power plants, small power plants, but captive power will be the most important sector or business. Okay, now. Over there is, let's say, there is some space, some room for entrepreneurs that are willing to look for their role on this in terms of making a solution, preparing the discussions of the PPA, discussion on yields. There is a lot of space there, but in captive power, no, for local ones, they should be working on the community side.
So, you know, there's a question on my side, and what you mean captive power is that, for example, a factory or a business that requires a diesel generator that has no access to a grid?
That's right. That's right. The point is that we have very important, for example, we are speaking always about mining companies, no? Mm-hmm. But there are not only mining companies. There are, for example, breweries, okay, in certain countries in Africa that are willing to have some kind of only access to electricity, let's say, because they don't have good access and reliable access to electricity. And this is a very important, market. And not that we need to get focused on mining, okay, because there are a lot of industrial sectors that are willing to these things to happen.
Okay. Well, it sounds like an opportunity there for someone, you know, with some capital and willingness to go into this business. So, right. So there is an interesting question which you know, is related, which is how are you dealing with maintenance and support for these remote installations? Are you training local people?
We've actually employed two I would say general strategies. The first is we work with local partners that have service personnel that are familiar with operating in some of these remote areas. The one thing I would mention is, you know, the telecom sector has actually done a phenomenal job at deploying technical resources in remote areas. And so often the places I've been to, the village may not have electricity, but I have 3G connections. And so we've actually piggybacked on a lot of the telecom providers, the small companies that are servicing the telecom base stations that have the technical resources that we need for the microgrid, and simply just training them a little bit. The other option is actually training the microgrid developer or the operator of the system. I mentioned the Gumanche installation we did in Australia. We actually trained the folks that will be operating the system. Generally speaking, you know, particularly with our microgrids, they're in load following mode. So there's no active control that's really required. The system is adapting automatically to changes in load. And so there's no, you know, no overt intervention that's necessary. And so really it's just about kind of doing your basic battery maintenance, checking the engines. And of course, everyone knows there's a lot of knowledge out there on how to manage diesel engines. And solar panels don't necessarily fail on a day-to-day basis. And so really it's the batteries and the engine are sort of the weakest points. And it's fairly straightforward to train personnel on how to manage that.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a question here from Martin, who is writing from Kenya. So he's saying a question to Isaac. Is there potential for more utility PV in Kenya in the near future, considering the slow demand and capacities of PV, wind and geothermal being added. Slightly off topic, but what are your thoughts, Isaac?
Very good question. I think that is a very good question. I think it's just a mixed, question answer that I'm going to give. No, at the end of the day, we have a situation in which solar PV is quite competitive now. The grid capacity in Kenya, it's what it is. Okay, we know that they have around 2,500 megawatts installed. Okay, and we cannot install one, let's say 1,000 megawatts of solar, 1,000 megawatts of wind, and 1,000 megawatts of geothermal. It has no sense. Okay, the point is that there is capacity to get more utility scale PV, probably 400 megawatts, 500 megawatts, no more than that. Okay, combined with wind and with geothermal, but we need to combine this with the, let's say, with the deployment of a new grid and with the deployment of storage in the country. It's something that we need to keep in mind, because in Kenya, it's important not only the consumption, but probably if we can have some more production in Kenya, it will be possible to create more consumption. Okay, these are two factors that grow jointly. Okay, but also it's quite important speaking about the stability of the grid and the forecast. Okay, we need to think that wind energy, solar energy are not non-dispatchable energies, and we need to have something that will help us. The answer is yes, there is more, let's say, there's more possibility to have more utility scale PV, wind, geothermal, and those technologies, but combined with solution for forecast, for storage, we cannot do these things that we are doing now in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much, Isaac, for your answer. And we have a question here by a viewer called Arshad, which I think goes, straight into the heart of Asia. And he asks, how do you deal with the risk of default from multiple off-takers in a community microgrid project? So he points out that, the majority of consumers might be of low income and have no collateral. These are investments that require that they are capital intensive upfront. So how do you manage this risk?
Yeah, no, it is very much it is a risky endeavor to go and do community scale microgrids in remote areas. We've seen, one model that I think the industry in general has tried is what we call the anchor tenant model, which is where you have a large commercial customer that is your primary off-taker. And that's really what you use to finance the microgrid, and then you have export to other residential customers. What we've seen is that when we've looked at the space, the most viable microgrids are the ones that have a good mix of commercial and residential. So pure residential is very difficult to have these large scale systems really be viable. If you have a lot of commercial usage, then you have a tendency to have higher payment rates because people don't want their business to shut down. And also the nice thing about commercial is that it coincides with solar production for the most part. And so you actually have the cheapest power available for your commercial customers who have the highest payment rates. And so it goes back to site selection, really. I think what we've seen is that, finding those villages that have some commercial activity in place, that have diesel installations are the most viable candidates for these type of microgrids.
Thank you, Ricky. Isaac, would you like to add anything?
No, I think the explanation has been quite good. This is the reason, because I have mentioned that possibility of mini grids, microgrids with centralized management. Thinking on PPAs, it's quite difficult to manage this kind of risk without donors, without grants. Keeping in mind that the equity that you are going to invest probably will not have any return. Something that we need to think about, and that's the reason because let's say the private companies should look for a, let's say, master PPA. A lot of communities with a master PPA, with a regulator, with a local institution, a national institution, but managing this risk directly with the consumer is not impossible, but it's quite difficult.
Okay, well, thank you. So I think we've had a good mix of questions. So let's go back to a bit more of a technical question, which I'm sure the answer is going to be it depends, right? But the Atanu asks, what would be the ratio between diesel generation, solar, and storage to sustain power through a mini grid for say 3 days? well, suppose it depends on the solar resource and etc. So over to you, Ricky.
Yeah, it as you said, Carlos, it very much depends. You know, we tend to size our diesel system for what we expect to be the peak demand in the community, because really when push comes to shove, that is the asset that will actually be online to serve peak demand. We generally have the solar systems be just a little bit larger, because we can then charge the batteries. You know, as sort of both I and Isaac mentioned, I think we generally 2 to 4 hours of batteries kind of the most economic. So, you know, and the solar system, it really depends on, you know, as Carlos mentioned on the resource, you know, generally we've tried to size, like I said, our solar and our diesels roughly the same, and our diesel is generally sized for peak demand.
Thank you. Yes, I know it's a difficult question to answer. I think that one thing that I got from both your presentations is how hard it is to actually predict demand and decide and size the system. And the first thing that popped into my head is who's paying for all of these studies, because the studies themselves, it seems that you need to actually have a lot of do a lot of groundwork before you even start the system. So are they typically paid by some grant by an international financial institution or by governments, or who is helping size the need and the resources?
I think there is very much a large component of this that is grant funded. So I don't think we're at the stage yet where these microgrids are viable entirely with private capital. So generally we'll have some sort of study that will be done, perhaps under sort of funding support from the multilateral development institutions. In some cases, we've actually tried to work with the developer to incorporate the cost of the survey into the overall project economics, but generally they come with some form of grant capital that really mitigates that upfront cost.
Okay, well that makes sense. Isaac, would you like to add anything?
No, the point is that you have a lot of, let's say, instruments, a lot of let's say, financing lines coming from the multilateral institutions, and you can use these ones, no? But at the end of the day, you need grants, you need donors, okay? Because in other way, it will not be feasible to do it. Because at the end of the day, we're speaking about projects that we need to keep in mind. It's not easy to develop such kind of projects. It will take a long time until you reach a situation in which you are able to build these small power plants, okay? We're not speaking that you are able to find and to solve this situation in 6 months. We're speaking about periods of 1 year, 1 year and a half, 2 years, to have everything in place, to agree with the land, to agree with the local institutions. It's not easy, and for that you need this grant and donors.
Mm-hmm. And I know that both of you are more on the business side, but thinking of the social side, do you know of any studies that have been made about how incomes or economic outcomes have progressed after these kind of projects? Because the first, I would think that they would improve, that you would have more economic activity, more entrepreneurship, you have more things going on once you have power in a community. Have you seen some of that?
We did. I remember we were working with Practical Action, which is a large international NGO, and they've done a fair amount of work in mini-grids. And I think they mentioned that some of the deployments that they've had have seen substantial increases in income generation opportunities and population increases because people tend to move where there are resources. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I certainly know that they've from the mini-grids that they've studied, from the ones they've deployed, they've seen positive returns.
Okay.
Let me give you only an idea, Carlos, that I think is important. At the end of the day, I have mentioned that in Kenya, almost 60% of the financial transactions happen through the mobile phone, okay? If you are able to provide access to electricity to all these people, you will have M-Pesa for 100% of the population in Kenya. You will have M-Pesa in Tanzania, in Zambia, and the people will start to create these own companies, business, etc. It's quite clear.
Right. Yeah. So Well, it's it's just a thought I had now looking at all the bigger picture, not just a project or the technical aspects. We have an interesting question here, I think, which is more on the technical, but on a theoretical side. So, do you see a price level in which I think the question is quite long, but I think the question is in which solar with storage would be on an equivalent basis to diesel generation, to a hybrid system?
So I think we're already seeing solar and storage systems on an LCOE basis get better than diesel. But I think the challenge is the availability over multiple days, and being able to ensure that your system is available, when you have 4 or 5 days of bad weather. And that's where the capital expenditures get out of control, and become unsustainable at the moment. But I think, if we get down to lithium ion prices that are at the $200 a kilowatt hour, lead acid really hasn't budged from the 1 to 130 range that it's in right now. The life cycle costs are getting much better. So you get maybe 4,000 cycles if you take very good care of the battery, a lead acid battery. You're seeing close to 10,000 cycles now on lithium ion batteries. So on a life cycle basis, that's getting down there. And solar costs, of course, have come down. Certainly more on the utility scale than the distributed side. But we're at that sort of 40, around the 30-40 cent a watt range, plus $200 a kilowatt hour for the batteries. That is a very, very competitive solution.
Okay. So when it gets, even though the price is good now, when you have good weather, when the ACE doesn't become competitive is when you have bad weather, which means that you have to oversize the system, right, to account for those instances.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and you generally have then much lower utilization on your system overall, which is now capital that's tied up into an asset that's not actually operating. And so, yeah, I think that's the challenge. It's the 4 days of batteries that you need, if you have 4 days of cloudy weather.
Right. I see. All right. And a question for eyesight, which comes from me, is that you mentioned that you expect some of these technologies to come from Asia and from Africa, if I remember correctly, right? It was you. So, so have you seen some of these, or some of the technologies or the innovations coming from the regions where these solutions are going to be used?
Yes. Why I'm saying this? No, the point is that most, let's say, from technology point of view, most of the things are coming now in terms of the deployment from Asia and from the States. No, but for example, in terms of forecast, there is something quite important. We are learning a lot in Africa, okay, with the different utilities. At the end of the day, we are used to have only, let's say, some forecasts for quite a stable grid. And now in Africa, we are learning a lot how to make a forecast for solar. That is quite important for the storage and for the mini grids in the future, okay? And we are working on this with the different utilities. And the next generation, okay, of forecast providers will come from Africa, will not come from the States or Spain or Japan or China, no? Will come from Africa, because over there is where this solution is needed, where the people know which are the problems and how to solve them. No? And this is something that now we are experiencing, no? In terms of on the forecast for solar. No? Something has happened with wind, okay, but it was at the start. But now with solar, it will be pretty clear. And I hope that in the near future, okay, with more access to electricity, there will be some technical solutions in terms of storage coming from Africa.
Thank you very much, Isaac. And I think that, as with all good things, this webinar also has to come to an end. And I'd like to thank all of the viewers and the speakers as well for being here with us today. Would you, Ricky, would you like to say any parting words to our audience?
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us on what is, we believe, a very important topic. And, I think both Isaac and I share the hope that we will be in a position in 5, 10, 15 years from now where mini grids have become much more viable and are really serving a significant portion of the underserved population right now.
Thank you, Ricky. Isaac, any last thoughts for our audience?
Yes, I think it's an idea, no? That in a market in which we are speaking now about PPAs, tenders, all these things, okay? This is a quite exciting market that is deploying mini grids and microgrids all around the world. There is a space for the smaller companies, for the bigger companies to make things interesting, quite interesting things, and it's the right market to be in the next 10, 15 years.
Thank you very much. Food for thought there for our audience, and well, I'd like to once again thank both our speakers and our attendees. Remember that you will get in a few days' time, you'll get the slides and the webinar recording as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Sterling and Wilson, who have actually made it possible for us to have these webinars free of attendance. So thank you very much for attending. Go to our webpage, atainsights.com, and there you'll be able to see all of the other webinars we have listed for the end until the end of the year and 2019 and beyond. Thank you very much. Have a good day and see you soon.